The main three Allied powers were Great Britain and their leader Winston Churchill, the United States and their leader Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the Soviet Union and their leader Joseph Stalin. These three central allies were called the Big Three. The three main Axis powers in World War II were Germany with their leader Adolf Hitler, Italy with their leader Benito Mussolini, and Japan with their leader Hideki Tojo. The Axis powers were defeated by Allied powers in 1945, but before that, throughout the war, the different powers used many war strategies.
We will be discussing today's breaking news, starting off with what is known as the Lightning War. Germany's forces are trying out the Blitzkrieg in Poland and are planning to successfully employ the tactic with invasions of Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in 1940. This military tactic was designed to create disorganization among enemy forces through the use of mobile forces and locally concentrated firepower. Its successful execution results in short military campaigns which preserves human lives and limits the expenditure of artillery. This method breaks through the opponent's line of defense by short, fast, powerful attacks and then dislocates the defenders using speed and surprise to encircle them with the help of air superiority. Let's watch a video to examine this tactic in action.
At the outbreak of war, only the Germans understood the importance of concentrating all their mechanized forces in one fast-moving push for the enemy's weak points. The architect of this blitzkrieg was Heinz Guderian. His belief in tank power is summed up by his catchphrase, Nicht kleckern, klotzen. Don't tickle, smash.
Germans used tanks in concentration. They were used at the point of a spear instead of being spread out along the front.
Guderian was aware that tanks on their own would be vulnerable to Allied counterattack. They needed close support.
The key to the blitzkrieg was the combination of armor, infantry, artillery, and the Luftwaffe with the Stuka dive bomb.
U.S. forces absorbed the lessons of 1940 and used blitzkrieg tactics in the liberation of Europe. Fast-moving tanks had to be supported by fast-moving infantry. Only infantry could deal with infantry threats. Half-tracks, jeeps, and tanks themselves carried the infantry, crucial to the tank's survival.
You could get infantry that could move as fast as the tanks. The infantry could protect the tanks from the very dangerous infantry threats that you have lining every ditch.
They loved the tanks for other purposes. They rode on the tanks all the way through dangerous areas and then would get off if their artillery fire came in, which was attracted by the tank.
We learned that when both worked together, the tank got the benefit of the infantry's ability to maneuver, and the infantry got the benefit of the tank's armored firepower.
The new cavalry-style tactics would only be possible with good communication. Blitzkrieg or lightning war would need the best tactics and the best communications. They knew that.
Tactics are much more important than whether the tank has armor this thick or that thick, or whether the machine gun has, that caliber or that caliber. Those are all minor details compared to making the right decisions and have the right skills.
Guderian's solution to the problem of coordination was the new technology of FM radio.
And it's no big surprise that the main German advocate of tank warfare, Heinz Guderian, was a signals officer. He was a radio officer. Probably the most important feature on German tanks, which made them so effective in blitzkrieg, was not their armor, not their mobility, not their firepower, it was their radios.
Ironically, it was an American Army officer who invented the FM radio in 1934. Major Edwin Armstrong's FM sets were small enough to slip in a tank and gave a whole division multiple use of the same frequency.
By the time you get to the interwar period, you have people attempting to make them smaller, but it's not really until the mid to late 30s that they become small enough to install in tanks.
In May 1940, German forces invaded France. Within 6 weeks, French and British resistance had collapsed, and Nazi divisions were in Paris. Amazingly, the French had more tanks, bigger guns, and thicker armor. The French Char 35 was widely considered the best tank in the world. But what it didn't have was FM radio sets.
And so the Germans, with inferior numbers, inferior armor, and everything carved through them like a hot knife through butter.
Soon, all countries cottoned on to the importance of radio communication between tanks and commanders. Everyone got better FM radios into their tanks.
Incidentally, these tanks who had intercommunication with each other, of course, so that the platoon leader could instruct a tank on his left, enemy tank approaching on your left flank. Give him help.
Lives depended on the ability of commanders to communicate directly with their crews, even over the noise of a 35-ton monster and the boom of tank-on-tank combat.
One strategy that the Allied power Britain used throughout the war was the lieutenant strategy. During World War II, Britain was unable to match the United States militarily, so they outstripped other American allies both in the quantity of their military resources and in their willingness to use them at the demand of the Americans. Britain recognized that they could not be America's equal, however, they could act as America's lieutenant, thus the name of this strategy being the lieutenant strategy. The British maintained a full-spectrum military force, smaller than the U.S. military but more capable across the board than militaries of other U.S. allies.
The Allied powers used a defeat Hitler first strategy against the Axis powers. FDR and Winston Churchill agreed to defeat Hitler first to focus on the war in Europe before trying to defeat Japan at the Atlantic Chapter meeting. During the first 2 years of the war, 85% of the U.S. war effort was focused on Europe.
On December 22nd, 1941, just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Winston Churchill arrived in Washington to meet with President Roosevelt. The British Prime Minister was grateful for a new ally in his fight against the Axis, and outspoken in his opinion of the enemy.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
FDR and Churchill met for 2 weeks, plotting their war strategy. The leaders agreed that defeating Hitler would be their top priority. Once Europe was freed, Allied forces could be redeployed to help the U.S. defeat Japan. The plan was set. But through the bleak months of 1942, the Nazi war machine marched on. In the Atlantic, Germany's submarine attack groups, wolf packs, devastated Allied shipping. Nazi influence spread through the Mediterranean and into North Africa, threatening British colonies there. On the Eastern Front, German forces pushed deep into the Soviet Union and descended on the city of Stalingrad. In the skies over Europe, German anti-aircraft artillery exacted a heavy toll on Allied warplanes.
How did you play a role in World War II? I was a soldier in the United States Army during the war. What was one war strategy that the U.S. Army used? The U.S. Army used a strategy called island hopping. The attack was led by General Douglas MacArthur. How did the U.S. Army use island hopping? The U.S. troops targeted islands that were not as strongly defended by the Japanese. We took control of those islands and quickly created landing strips and small military bases. Once that was done, we proceeded to attack other islands from the bases we established. What was the purpose of island hopping? Island hopping allowed the U.S. Army to move closer to Japan by gaining military bases and securing the many small islands in the Pacific.